Big crowd today. I guess everybody heard there's going to be free wine. I just want to thank everyone for coming out and welcoming you to the last lecture for our 2009-2010 series. I thank everybody that's been coming out every week and listening to these talks. It's been a great series. Just remind everyone that's out there that we are offering this talk also through webcasting, so you don't need to show up every week. You can just turn on your computer. Today's speaker is no stranger to any of you, I'm sure. Certainly no stranger to me. Oh, well. Kevin Kerr, the newly minted PhD, Kevin Kerr, a man who has had 30 years and more of experience in horticulture in Ontario, specifically in viticulture. I've known Kevin since our days at University of Guelph, where I met him. I was a fresh MSc student, and Kevin was finishing up his BSc at that time. So that takes us back quite a few years. And so even though we both lost a little bit of hair over the last 30 years, and maybe what's left is getting gray, we still are good friends and colleagues. So I'm very much looking forward to this talk today. So Kevin, I'll let you take over.
Thank you, Andy. I appreciate everyone coming today. The end of May on a wonderful day is a tough time to be inside. Mind you, the last few days with the heat, it's kind of been nice to be inside. The topic that I chose for this was, in the last few years, I've had the opportunity to travel back and forth to various regions of China. And most recently, in the last two visits, I've been in an area called Penglai China. And it's in Shandong province. And I'll give you a few maps and things just to get you oriented as to where I was. First off, when you put in perspective where China is relative to Asia and Southeast Asia, it's an extremely large country, very diverse. And when you start to look at it, some of the places that some of you would be familiar with would be, if we look at, would be Beijing is here, Shanghai further down the coast, Hong Kong is at the very southernmost point. And then in western China, if you follow the news, Urumqi, Kashi, out towards Afghanistan, and then over towards Russia with Tibet south of that. The reason I put it in perspective is that as large a country as China is, and ranging relative to Canada, I found out very quickly that all of China is in one time zone. I landed originally in Beijing and flew out to Urumqi and went to Turpan. It was a 4.5-hour flight, and I was still in the same time zone. It was quite interesting to wake up at 9 o'clock in the morning and realize that they'd been going that much faster in the east. Everything operates on Beijing time. So in some places they say that the world revolves around the sun. Well, it's also, in China, it appears the working world revolves around Beijing. China in perspective and where it fits with world wine, and I trying to find cumulative statistics for the country of China has been somewhat of a challenge. But in a few of the documents I could find, they were listing them number 4 in world grape production. Now, to put this in perspective, this is wine grapes as well as table grapes. There is a substantially and extremely large table grape industry in western China and southwestern China. They are considered number 5 in the volume of wine produced. Now, again, trying to dig through, it kind of puts us, for those of you familiar with the Ontario question of volume of wine produced in Canada and the cellared in Canada wines and the VQA wines, at least for Ontario. Well, it's a similar situation in China in that they really cumulatively put together blended wines along with their own 100% domestic. In fact, I did not find very many pure domestic wines. Most of them had some form of blending associated with them. In 2005, from the data, and part of this was from the OIV, they were considered number 6 in the total volume of wine consumed in the world. This is not on a per capita basis. I think if you put it on a per capita basis with 1 billion people, if we could get up to even Canada standards per capita, China would take the world wine lake and consume it instantly. But it's a rather large volume of wine, and it is continuing to expand. And that was a few of the things that I found in talking with people and their projections of where they want to go. They projected increase of the current wine consumption by 25% by 2013. Now that's amazing. That's absolutely amazing to say that much more wine will be consumed within China. But the status of wine has changed within China. It has now become a more common drink. It is used for toast. It's used by groups. The government is using wine as part of any of their festivities that they're doing. So all of this is leading most of the people within wine to take a chance to try a little bit more. Now, I'm not saying it's great wine, but it's a move afoot to increase consumption. The major wine regions, and to put it in perspective again where I was, this is the Penglai Yantai region in Shandong. They also have Yantai, which is Yantai. The other one, Tulifan in the west, and Shihezai in Xinjiang province is another one that I had visited. I haven't had a chance to get into the central areas in Taigu and Shanxi, but each one of these is an evolving wine area, not in large scale and certainly not at the world standards level, and I can openly say that, but they are wine producing areas that weren't traditionally producing them before. It's something that, as I said, has started to evolve really within the last 3 decades of wine becoming part of an accepted beverage of choice. The 5 major ones in the east that people would know of would be Hebei, as well as Shandong, Tianjin, Xinjiang, Henan, and then Xinjiang province. Out here again, this is a large table wine producing area in western China. Or sorry, not table wine, but table grape producing area. This is where I was. So when you try and take a look at it, you have the Yellow River coming in, the Yangtze down below at Shanghai. It's midway between Beijing and Shanghai, the 2 largest cities. And this is also at a point, Pacific Ocean. Korea is close by. And in this particular area is where they call the intersection of the Yellow Sea and the Bohai Sea. And this particular area is also highly desired as a tourist destination. They have a large tourist population, and people go there in substantial. Even when I was there in March of this year, temperatures were ranging about 5 to 7 degrees Celsius. It was cold, and there were tour buses on top of tour buses on top of tour buses going through this area. Now, they have some other types of attributes in the area where people want to visit, but I found it really quite interesting. We wouldn't think of deciding that we're going to go visit Niagara Falls in the middle of March and think this is a lot of fun. But they still have a large number of people going. Now, Yantai, the city itself, in Shandong, Yantai is the major one, has a population of about 4 million people. Penglai itself, in the major region, which is about an hour's drive away, has about 400,000 people. What was most surprising is that Yantai made me think of Hamilton in terms of the density and types of things. And Hamilton only has 350,000 people. So suddenly I expected Penglai was going to be something, and it wasn't. It felt like maybe St. Catharines or smaller. I was really quite surprised at the figures that I was given. Tourist attractions were a big part of this, and I use this as a lead-up because this is part of what they're banking on in terms of building their industry. In Shandong, they have the Penglai Pavilion. They also have a rather large tourist attraction which refers to the 8 Immortals. The 8 Immortals are a fairy tale that was written years ago, and it was a reference to 7 men and 1 woman that were there, and they decided they were going to prove that they were better than the rest of the world. And literally on the, sometimes I love the true English translation of a Chinese script because they had translated it somehow without thinking about what they put. But they, according to this, the 8 of them had gotten together and consumed and got drunk and decided to cross the Bohai Sea without using boats. And that's how they became immortal and came back, and suddenly people realized that they were that much better. Now, this is the fairy tale story behind it. But again, people go, there's pictures, there's all kinds of things that go along with it. So they have recognized, the wineries that are developing in the area, recognizing that there's a tourist attraction, and they are trying to balance the two together and tie in. If there's already natural traffic, how do we get a hold of some of this traffic? Gold mining in this particular area is the 3rd highest gold mining area within China itself. Well, one of the things that we have to think about is the type of area that it is. Its primary soil is often granites, limestones, and hard stones, and gravel base. Within this small area, they produce 20,000 hectares of apples. And when we put in perspective, and I don't know, and Ken may know better than I, but I'm not sure whether we've got 20,000 hectares of apples in Ontario, total. And this is just in one little area. Currently at grapes, they have 5,333. This is from their wine bureau, which was producing 75,000 tons of wine grapes right now. Their target, though, is they want to get to 15,000 hectares of production within the next 5 to 10 years. They want to triple their production within this one geographic area. So how are they going to do it? And what I was watching was very interesting. Vegetables were another 4,000 hectares. It markets itself, and I put this down because they keep talking about being one of the 7 world grape coasts for wine. And I can't find anywhere where they list all of the other 6. The only time I could find some references, they referred to South Africa, to France, to US, Australia, but they never elaborated. And then they would trail off into another statement. So sometimes the written word and how they're doing it. Yet if you go to the web and you type in 7 world grape coasts, on the web, Penglai instantly comes right to the forefront as the very first one. They held an international forum, but they don't say who attended. There was a few things that I find, like any area when you first go in, trying to find out hard facts that are written that you can go back and trace back, sometimes not as easy as one would think. In the area, it's a mountainous and very hilly area where a lot of the grapes are. They don't have any flatlands that would be comparable to Niagara-on-the-Lake or anything like that. This would be more like almost permanent Niagara escarpment setups, in that you have north-facing, west-facing, east-facing slopes. You have some south-facing slopes, some water areas, things like this. The parent material primarily is granite limestone. Their soil textures were either a light loam, which 50% of the cultivated area was a very light type of soil, 15% medium, and coarse sands at 21%. The organic matter level from all of the results that I had read throughout the area didn't show any of their vineyard areas of having even 1% of organic matter naturally occurring in it. So they were relying a lot of supplemental green manures as well as animal and poultry manure to try and supplement this. But they were losing it very quickly because of the coarse texture of the soil. This gravel base, excellent drainage. They do have high precipitation and natural rainfall, and I'll talk about that in a bit, but at no point do they have saturated soils. And this is just some of the perspectives. The light in here is not quite as good as I'd hope, but it's a very dry, desolate. On your immediate right, the upper right-hand corner, that's basically granite. And the reason I put that little picture in there is that they use the granite from there for everything. Granite is everywhere. Tile is everywhere. They use it. Now, we may think of a piece of granite tile that we would go for, $8, $10, $12 a square foot. Over there, it would be about 35 cents. Granite, it's their natural resource, so they use it for everything. Signs in vineyards, posts, you name it, it's used everywhere. Tile is used. It's one of the things of using what they have available to them. And when you see a few of the pictures later on of what they build with, they use the resources. This was a picture of what will be a vineyard. They run in terraces. This soil in here is at most maybe 50 centimeters deep before I start to hit the granite. This was primarily peanuts that they were growing, and these were actually peanut beds. You'll notice the pictures will jump back and forth because I've got some from last fall and some from this spring. So if suddenly the vines have leaves and then they don't have leaves, it's only because of the ones I've selected. They did determine, though, that they were using peanuts on their shallowest ground, then they would grow corn on slightly deeper ground, and then they would move into grapes and tree fruit as the ground got deeper yet. So they have identified fairly quickly. Now, a lot of these are not naturally occurring terraces. These would have been handmade terraces hundreds of years ago in this particular area to grow the crops. These were not something that was a natural occurrence, but they do it that way to optimize the flatness. The reason being, when precipitation occurs, they want to try and capture it because it will move through the soil profile very quickly, so they need to get it somewhat flat. If they left it as a straight slope, it would all run right off and they wouldn't have anything left. Here's a picture. The one prior was a south-facing slope. This was a north-facing slope. This distance from the base here to here is about 1.5 meters to 2 meters. So they're fairly substantial. And as you navigate, it's not very simply walking along the edge and hopping over. You do that a couple of times, but when you have to go back, it's not quite as much fun. A lot of gravel mixed into it. They have 590 millimeters of precipitation annually. So it's not a dry area. 200 plus frost-free days, which I found very interesting. The coldest temperatures in this area was -6 to -8 Celsius, and their warmest temperatures ranged anywhere from 32 to 34 Celsius. One of the challenges was that during their warmer months, roughly around veraison our time, which would veraison for their development for grapes, they also can be subjected to monsoon rains that they can blow in quite heavily. So they get very nervous at that point. And then just as fast as they arrive, they leave. So the latter part of the growing season is relatively dry. So though the precipitation numbers may seem elevated to you or to others, it is a high precipitation in a condensed period of time and then a period of dry weather. So this is why they're trying to find varieties that will manage and survive in these types of climatic conditions. Yet, they also recognize that the varieties they want to grow are the same as the rest of the world. They want to grow, get into the vinifera varieties that the consumer will recognize from France, from Italy, or from wherever. So it becomes that challenge of maybe not picking the particular varieties that might be absolutely suited climatically for their zone and kind of force-fitting other varieties into them, which seems to be the want of most areas around the world. We try and look at what was there and try to emulate what has been done by others. These are the predominant ones that they were growing. Cab Sauvignon, Cabernet Franc, Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, Riesling as well. I saw Tannat, I saw Tempranillo. They had, I didn't see any hybrids, at least in the commercial blocks at the commercial wineries. I have been in their research plots at some of their places, and they do have some of the hybrids stuck in there in what I would call a variety block, but you don't see anyone growing them. I kept looking because everyone keeps talking about ICEWINE in China in varying degrees, and are they going to try and go there? Well, as you can see, this particular region really wasn't interested in ICEWINE from that standpoint because they weren't going to get cold enough to meet ICEWINE standards. It doesn't mean that there wasn't ICEWINE sold, but I'm just saying that they had no intentions of moving into an ICEWINE production style. Go back. This is one of the wineries, their vineyard. They go into a VSP system. Vine spacing, this particular block I had walked through. This was a joint French-China venture. One of the wineries there had an investor from France involved. And so I asked them how was it going and onwards. And the French had been there for the initiation of the vineyard and would come back maybe once a year or every other year after it had started. And then, so there were issues that were developing in there that they were relying on external advice, but it wasn't there on a regular basis. So a lot of it was hit and miss in terms of what they were getting. If you notice the curling of the leaves, I was a little concerned, and Annie would be familiar, downward rolling leaves, dark bright red color, veins were green, then veins were either bright purple. I have suspicion that they've got leaf roll virus in there, but they're not really, no one's ever fully identified it. A few people were trying to tell me, oh no, this is the way the vines are every year. Well, that's almost telling me right away that that's what it is, but it was kind of interesting. This was a cab block. As you can't really tell, but on your extreme right, if you notice that first vine, notice the colors of the leaves and everything else being totally off relative to the rest of the block, was one of the signatures. Their spacing and how they were putting them into play, it was almost like they were trying to run from a textbook that they were handed, but they hadn't taken into account shadow implications or impact. Now, this wasn't too bad late day. This was taken roughly about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. But as you notice, the shadowing started to creep up into what would be their fruit zone area, so they're going to lose late day sun. So I was a little concerned from that standpoint that they hadn't got their row spacing and orientations quite correct to maximize sunlight interception and get fruit ripening. But these are all things I must openly say, if you asked us in Ontario 40 years ago about a lot of these things, we really weren't thinking as much about it at the time as it was, I want to get a vineyard in the ground. Well, I sort of feel that this particular area is moving at a pace beyond its local knowledge level at the moment, but they're gaining quickly. As I mentioned, they were running vertical shoot positioning for the majority of the training system. There was some low cordon spur pruning in there. General spacing, by and large, they had not moved in, and I was surprised considering the gravel soils and the low organic matter levels They had not moved into the ultra-high density vines of parts of France of meter by meter or 1.2. They were staying very much at a 2.2 meter or a 2 meter, I should say 2.2 is a little large, but 2 meter by 1.1 to 1.2 meter spacing in the row. 99% of the work done in these vineyards is by people. It is not machine-oriented. So they've gone to a better spacing from that end for that. They don't need to have the extra wide rows to get equipment up and down and things like that. As I showed you before, terrace plantings, the granite posts, and a few of the following slides that I've got will highlight a little bit about these posts. This is a concrete setup. This is behind the Great Wall Winery. Great Wall is the largest winery within China. This particular facility in Penglai was processing 50,000 tons itself per year of grapes, which people will nod, and I keep thinking, that's the Ontario industry out of one building. This was just one of the wineries in the area itself that were doing it. There were a substantial number of smaller wineries. But again, the spacing, as you can see the soil, it's very fractured, very light in texture, warms very quickly, drains very easily. Other ones where they had run, and this is at another vineyard, this was a cab block, they had actually put trenches in and they were doing flood irrigation in terms of a water management system. They hadn't looked at trickle irrigation, they weren't interested in sprinkler setups, they were using passive irrigation systems as their mechanism. I mean, it appeared to be working, but it was kind of interesting just to see what they were going to try and do. Here's a picture of some other ones. They seem to take, rather than trying to make a large area into a single block, they were trying to take a series of small blocks and they would utilize them. If you notice, you've got rows that in Ontario you would never see this, or in many parts, because you would say, well, a tractor driver would go crazy. Well, there's no tractor drivers, so they weren't overly concerned. The natural terraces were there. That's how they planted the rows. I was concerned because they were following these natural terraces to the degree they weren't taking into account as much, again, that solar interception. So there were some shading impacts that I feel were happening in parts of the blocks. But I wasn't there to criticize or tell them that things were this way. I spent as much time asking them why. And a lot of this came back to was that they felt they were going to utilize what was there.
What was the latitude?
37 degrees north latitude. Here's another picture, and I'll show you this one. I love this building. It's on a website, and this is a winery called Treaty Port. Natural terraces, they used the stonework. This was taken in the spring. Every one of these posts is 4-inch cut granite. Now, we think over here about wood posts and steel posts and the price. Wood post over there was going to cost the equivalent of about $2 a post. A 4-inch cut granite post was about 75 cents. So they said, we're going to use granite posts. But very shallow soils. There were no anchors at the ends of the rows. So again, I think that was part and parcel of very short rows to reduce the tension on the wires on the row. They could only tighten to a certain point. Treaty Port, I'll explain a little bit more, but this is when you get large-scale investment people with a lot of money into a country where costs are far less than what you would imagine, and you decide to build yourself a replica of a Scottish castle. To give you a size difference, this is a friend of mine that I take along. I joke to him now, he's my reference point for taking. Peter and I have traveled over a large number of places in the world. Peter's 6 feet 4 inches tall. So that gives you an idea of the length of that particular post. So their top wires were running at about 6 feet. They were running their cordons down below at roughly about 2.5 feet or in the neighborhood of about 80 centimeters. So in that region. So that's not too bad. But again, if you look on the slide, look to your immediate right, you'll notice that they go along and there's a few rows, and then, boom, a terrace goes up and then the next rows. They do it's a lot of what I would call step growing to give them enough flat areas to work with. Here's another block again, Peter standing beside, showing the cordon again. 4 wires, they were doing a lot of tucking. So we were asking. So at the vineyard level, when you have a winery, what happens is they have small sections of the vineyards given to a manager, and the manager is 100% responsible for what work is done within that vineyard. So to try and use an example, let's say either Pilotary or Cave Spring or something, they would have, for the size of acreage that they've got, they would have like 8 vineyard managers And each one would have their block, and they sort of compete against one another. What I found most interesting is they were to work together and everything else, yet at the end of the growing season, they all rate one another. And so you have this pecking order of who's going to rate each other, because you don't rate yourself, you rate the other 7 people, and then that determines who gets bonuses and who doesn't get bonuses. So sometimes, let's just say that it's not the most collegial attitudes in terms of things, but they all walk through each other, but that's how they do it. Rather than have one overall manager and a series of people, each one is given a small responsibility. Here's one that they were doing. They were going just to basically a head with a couple of spurs on it, trying individual posts. I'm not sure why. Again, it was one of these. I saw it. I took a picture of it. But without the interpreter nearby and being able to ask people that were doing the work, sometimes I didn't quite get the answer. So it always became one of those, geez, I really wonder. It becomes a That was one of that's what I called, this was at the people who had some money. This was their tractor and cultivation equipment. I did not see very many tractors at all, anywhere. This is what was a predominant one. 2-wheel, single-cylinder diesel engines with a wagon on the back. Now, this was taken in the last fall. These were the apple growers hauling their fruit in absolutely pristine fruit. Every fruit individually packaged and the rest of it. But the great people, everybody worked on these. These things operate everywhere. They're in the orchards, they're in the roads. They are also on the highways. I'm in a vehicle traveling around. Imagine yourself on the 401 going through downtown Toronto, and these things are all over the road. You got buses, you got tractor trailers, and you've got these, all sharing the same piece of road space. I didn't see any accidents. Closed my eyes a number of times, but didn't see any accidents. Within the Penglai region, I'll jump to the wineries now. There's 45 wineries in 2008. The latest figures that I also put out, they're up to 52 or 54 now in 2010. Great Wall is the largest. It's owned by COFCO. COFCO is cereals, oils, foodstuffs corporation. They are a monster. They came in after the fact and bought in. There was a couple of investors that had started Great Wall. Great Wall, as I said, they have 3 facilities across China. Each facility has the capability of processing 50,000 tons of grapes each. They have one in Xinjiang province, they have one in Hebei outside of Beijing, and they have another one here in Penglai. The other one was the Sino-French or Dynasty, which some people are familiar with. Changyu Yantai was the second largest one within the Penglai region itself. They were processing about 15,000 tons. Chateau Zhending, I love this because they call it Chateau, and they were located in the Nava Valley. I couldn't resist. Yantai Wine and Treaty Port, as I said, of an example of the later investment coming in. What was really interesting, and I met the vineyard person who'd been in China, Lafitte has in about an $8 to $10 million US investment going into this region over the next 3 years. They are in massive planting mode. However, at last, when I talked to Colin, and at the last count, they were having difficulty getting their vines in. For a number of years, the vines have been brought in from France without any difficulty. Suddenly this year, Beijing has taken over all the importation of vines, and suddenly they're not letting them in this year. But there is Italian vines getting in. So I'm not quite sure what's going on in terms of the bureaucratic world and the red tape world as to how this is functioning. This was at the Great Wall. I mean, and this is no big jump to look at, but state-of-the-art stainless, large tanks, everything climate controlled. This is the epitome of manufacturing. It was done on large scale, very much dictated as to what they were going to do. It was a formula, and they had worked it out. This fellow, I'll call it the English name, he called himself Bob. He had spent 3 years in Australia. He was a biochemist, a master's degree in biochemistry from 18 years ago, and had moved into the wine industry, and actually was out in Xinjiang province 3 years prior, and then now he was here. He was the overall manager and the major winemaker in response of this. If you watch their model for how they managed everything, it was very much a Japanese model of dictating flows and movements. It was really quite an interesting setup of how they were running it. This is the outside of Chateau Zhending. Now, this is only one perspective. This particular winery, when you get inside, the terrazzo tile floors, the giant atrium with glass over top of you, and that's just the entranceway. It would be like 5 times the size of this room. That just got you in. And you went into their barrel cellars and other things. Huge investment. I didn't see anybody there. I don't know how much money was spent on this, but I would have expected throngs of people traveling through it and going all around in this particular winery. They weren't there. Then I found out that they have a golf course, they have villas that you can rent while you're there, they have all the amenities attached to it. However, there's only certain times you can get it because most of the time the government is holding functions at this particular locale. So I'm not really sure how it all fit together of who knew what, but this was almost like here's the postcard, and it's not really the bulk of the real world with it, but this is what we want to show you, what we can do if we really want to put our mind to it. This was part of the view out of their tasting area, a wonderful tasting bar. Interesting thing about it, I didn't bring any of their wines back, and I'll talk a little bit about pricing of wines in a bit. This was, again, a tourist area, tourist approach to making wine. Another winery had gone the other route. Basic steel building with the tanks inside for fermentations, other things. A very small bottling line, yet they were producing in the neighborhood of 18 to 20,000 cases per year. This is back to Treaty Port. Here's on the upper level of our wonderful Scottish castle, right up to the point where you can travel up to the top to the turrets. The Chinese wines, and rather than go on, there's just so many things. I was trying to find how I can put it in perspective for you. The majority of the wines sold are in the 25 to 35 RMB value. And $1 Canadian is equivalent to 6.5 RMB. So we're talking there between $3 and $5 to $7 was the average bottle price of what they were selling across their country. These were blended wines. Rarely were they 100% domestic wine. Chile, Australia, France, they openly admit that they bring this, and they say it right up front. We bring all these in. They relabel them, they put Chinese names on them, they do a lot of things with them, and at the end, we'll have a tasting with some of the wines. You'll see the labels and how they put them out there, its image, its profile. A couple of them, but at the very end, I guess is to say some of them were very pricey. Labels, very much into the artistic style though, very bright, vibrant colors on a lot of the labels, trying to draw your attention to them. Now here's some of the other ones where I went through. And for those of you who can't see from the back, these two wines, this was 1,300 RMB and this is almost 1,100 RMB. So take out your little calculators, divide ballpark by 6. So now you're dealing with $200 Canadian and about 175 Canadian a bottle. The ones on the right, the whites that they were running their Chardonnays are $7.99 and $7.19. So over $100 Canadian per bottle is what they were charging. But I never saw anyone buy any of the wine while I was there. And to taste this wine, there's a whole other story behind it that I'll leave for another day. It was these two in here, that's just a little more of a close-up, right? $12.99 and the $1,100. Their target market is upscale restaurants. So their view is if we don't charge a premium dollar for it, then people won't think it's very good if it's low priced. Here was their highest ones, 1,979 RMB, so over $300 a bottle. It was beyond me. I don't know of anywhere that I'd pay $300 for a bottle of wine, but that's me. I guess it's my Scottish background and being a little tight with the purse strings. And then finally I came across that I couldn't track it down. If you can read the label says ICEWINE. So this was the Yantai winery. The light and fruity ice wine is made from grapes grown in Canada and brewed with internal advanced techniques. It is clear and has full-bodied, fruit-smelly vinosity and aftertaste. I don't think I'd ever put that on a Canadian label. I haven't quite figured out, fruit, smell, vinosity. Aftertaste. You're going to tell somebody it's got aftertaste. It just doesn't work right for me. So the summary, I guess, to go, and I've given you kind of a brief overview. I'm learning a lot. By no means do I say that I've seen all of it. They're rapidly expanding. To put in perspective very quickly, the Chinese Agricultural University has opened up a satellite campus in Yantai. It has 5,000 students. In 2002, they decided to start a Viticulture and Oenology program, their grape and wine program. They have 200 students in it right now. The bulk of them are going through for winemaking. But when I read through their course things, and they were very interested as to what Brock was up to and other things, they're very oriented, though, more to the biochemistry than it was anything else. It seemed like they were very interested in the structure and a package and a procedure. They hadn't quite moved into the art side, and I think that came from the instructors they had who really weren't winemakers. They were people that wound up being a biochemist that moved into winemaking, but hadn't spent the time to really move outside of that. They were looking at it very technically rather than artistically. Wine consumption, 5 to 10 years, a 50% increase. They had predicted 25%. The movement that's going along. Right now, huge push by the government for joint foreign investment. Massive. You want the land, you need the land, you've got foreign investment backing behind you, the government will get you the land. It is really a very different approach to things. Target markets, upscale. Shanghai, Beijing, they want to get into the restaurants, they want to get into those areas. They're not, the upscale people have no consideration of going to the world. The wines that they were making, though, that they wanted to, they would make in very small lots, and they were trying to get people like Jancis Robinson and others to taste them and write about them, but they weren't looking at it as a foothold to get into the world stage to sell their wine. They were relying on it to give more validation to what they were doing domestically. And the majority of the wines consumed will still be low-priced and foreign blends. It was a really big item in their minds. They felt there was a huge marketplace. Their markup is there, and that's the approach that they really wanted to take. So with it, I'll leave it on that note. As I said, there's a series of 14 other fingers I could go to, but never ever really do justice to it. I'm going back again this fall. Each time I learn more, I get emails on a regular basis back and forth. But to me, it's an interesting area. I'm learning as much because of how they do things and the process they follow. They were into compost and some other things that they hadn't really thought about before, which I found amazing for the intention to be self-sufficient, because there wasn't a lot of disposable income for fertilizers or other things. So with that, I will leave it open to questions at this point. Does anyone have any questions? Ken?
Okay, is it two different groups, growers and wineries, or is the winery own the grapes that they grow?
So your question is it two different groups? Is it the wineries and growers, or no? Really, it's the wineries and the growers together. But the wineries are pretty much telling the growers exactly what they need and how much they need, so that the growers aren't growing speculatively. Right. It's in response to a demand for something. So it's done from that. The average land size, and very quickly is put in. They refer to them as moo. There are 6 moos per hectare. An average person on their own might be running anywhere from 12 to 15 moo, and that would be it. So it's not a large area. You don't have one person with let's say 500 moo and 5 or 6 people. No, it's a series of people together that will give them their yields. The one group that had asked me over to take a look at things, they were putting together and they were planting 80 moo this year, but they would have a large number of people that would be involved with the planting of that many grapes.
Follow-up question, is there a lot of wineries, or is it 10 big ones, or is it thousands?
There's 3 big ones, and the rest of them would be small to middle. And in fact, an awful lot more of the small. But I guess what I'm calling small, they would build a huge chateau or building for a 10,000 case winery, because it was image, was a big thing, that what they wanted to put on display, but they really didn't need. There wasn't big facilities for processing, but they would have a big, grandiose entrance and gates and things like that you would go into. And then there were the other ones. To get a winery license over there, I learned you had to have a bottling line. And I visited one winery, and we're going in, we see the cases, and he says, the fellow just said, no, you can't go. He showed us the bottling line, and he said, well, you can't go over there. We couldn't visit. And as I'm walking by, the door is open. And the bottling line wasn't working, but they were manually filling all the bottles and manually labeling them. So the government edict was to get your license, you had to have this piece of equipment. But they were working under the premise you really didn't have to use it.
I'm wondering if I understand this correctly. I was educated in China, and I lived there, I'm old, so I was there in the Revolutionary period. And originally in this area, the farming was done by the people's communes, which means very large communal farming, maybe 70,000 people in one farm. And then after the decommunization in the late 70s or 80s, the farmers were given a series of small plots
It still somewhat follows that, in that there were families that were farming smaller areas, as you say, as it was before. But what has been happening was that the government, in its move, in the latest point, has been consolidating these parcels of lands from individuals rather than having them dispersed, individual dispersed over larger areas. But the terrain that I was on was not really conducive to equipment. Those terraces are not particularly large. One of those terraces might only be a tenth of an acre. So by the time you take your equipment and roads and everything else, it still wasn't becoming effective use. The other thing was that everyone over there that I noticed was everyone worked. So I don't think that there was a move to mechanize to put people out of gainful employment. So that they were doing was maintaining that style. It's just how it was being funneled into a winery and a grape growing system. Apple growers had their collectives, large collectives in which they all brought their apples to a single location. They were shipped from that. That I noticed still was going on, but not as much with the grapes.
Are there any, or what specific pests and diseases that you face in particular do they have in the ladybug?
No, at least I never ran into it. Times that I was over there or active, I did not see Asian lady beetle present. Asian lady beetle is native to the Himalayas. It really wasn't native to these particular areas. Powdery mildew, downy mildew, no black rot, which surprised me considering the climatic conditions they had. Should have been suitable for black rot. I didn't notice any berry moth, and because it was late season, early season, I wasn't in there in peak growing periods. They did talk about leaf hoppers being an issue periodically, but outside of that, not a huge range of what we haven't seen. I would consider we have more pests than they do in that particular area. A lot of their primary control, sulfur-based sprays, copper-based sprays, in terms of the fungicides that they were using. They had some of the botrytis materials available to them. I saw one of the spray books. It took a while to kind of work my way through. But I didn't notice any of the major insecticides that we've been running into.
I have a question from an online participant.
Mm-hmm.
Question. Is there an appellation system in place in China?
Is there an appellation system in place in China? Not to my knowledge. They have geographic areas, but there's no formal dictate that this wine comes from this particular area or this particular area or another. In fact, the Great Wall Winery in Yantai, in Penglai, was actually bringing in wine from Xinjiang province out in Urumqi and blending it in. So they weren't, but it went into the same bottle, so there was no definition from their standpoint. They haven't reached that level yet of going into appellations. They're talking about areas where they grow it, but they're not into legislation of identifying specifics at this point.
Are most of their marketing efforts that you mentioned, bringing critics in for acceptance and whatnot, for increasing domestic acceptance and consumption, or are they looking for export markets?
No, the majority of getting external people in was more for domestic validation. In other words, they could say to the domestic market, look, we've had very good reviews externally. This is why our wines are good. But the people that I talked to, the intention wasn't for the majority. There may be some very small, just again from the point of making your presence felt, but the bulk of it was to get to say in the domestic world, because in there I noticed a lot of it was this was just like, or this is like this, and that's how people responded to it in terms of advertising. So they weren't trying to say it was a French wine, they were trying to say it was like this, and so had tasted it and compared it to. But it wasn't as if you were trying to sell an external buyer for it, it was more for the internal. The marketing of it, and I didn't put a picture of it in there, the marketing is in the grocery stores. Big, vast aisles of wines, boxes, 5-liter, 10-liter, 20-liter, 750 milliliter bottles, of beverages in what would be almost like a giant Kmart style thing where you could buy clothes, this, that. The bottom was it reminded me somewhat of the Walmart over on off Louth, where you walk in, there's this massive food section along with everything else they're selling now. Well, it's the same thing there, except the one I was in was on a multi-level building. Andy?
What do you see as being the biggest challenges to the actual wine quality there? Well, that's a two-part question. For instance, fruit to come in, is it usually in good shape and is it usually high quality?
I would say right now, from what I saw, the fruit was of average to marginal quality, that they need to do a lot of work in the vineyards themselves. Green fruit, unbalanced fruit, They hadn't figured out sunlight exposures appeared to be an issue, and that part of it, I'm thinking these row orientations and sunlight. There was not a lot of leaf removal being practiced, though the vines themselves appeared somewhat to be in balance, but there was something just not quite right, and I suspect it was timing. So that would be the first part of the equation. The second part was this predisposition of the winemakers for visual clarity. The wines had to be a certain color. They had to have no cloudiness. There was, like, it was done from the aesthetic visual rather than thinking about the whole package of the visual as well as the flavor components. So I think that's going to have to evolve over time for them to move forward. But they're young, and they're, as I said, what appeared to me was that they were learning from a rote, regimented recipe style, and they haven't moved out yet to go there. But I'll be honest, I'm over there and talking to people, and some of the things that we take for granted, they haven't got there yet. So I think it's a matter of getting more information out. And they will get there, but the speed at which it occurs, I'm just not sure how fast, because I learned very quickly that you don't go dramatically against the path that they're following, because they'll bring you back to their path. And if they want to make you say something and they'll say, no, it won't work, they will make sure they demonstrate that it won't work. Now, it's not to say that they don't want to, but it's a matter you have to work with them rather than try and tell them something. And I don't think that's any different than anywhere else in the world, really. We just have to, that freedom of style and thing hasn't quite come through yet. Ken?
Are they missing anything like plant nutrition, irrigation that was still missing in the equation?
Nutrition is a big one. With extremely low organic matter levels in their soil, I looked at some of those soil analyses. They're deficient in a number of the mineral elements, and they haven't figured out how to apply them and adapt to them and put them to bring the vines into a better balance. And that will also impact on vine health, which impacts on wine quality.
And irrigation?
Irrigation, they had enough natural precipitation. I didn't see any situation where they were in what I would call stress growth from water restrictions. But it's a few of the places, it was more, I think, mineral element than anything else.
Did you see any quality control laboratories?
Yeah. Did I see any quality control laboratories? CCOVI's like state of the art right at the moment, way, way, way out there, and highly mechanized compared to some of them that I saw. Very, very rudimentary and basic. The larger wineries, yes, they had a formal lab set up, and they could do a lot of it. But the mid to smaller wineries had really elemental titration equipment and other things. And you know, again, you could see right on the wall, here's the numbers that you're supposed to have, kind of thing, and that's what the way they worked.
Talking about the color clarity issues, is there a lot of wine making tricks that they're using to improve color with additions and whatnot?
Oh yeah, they were blending stuff in. They would take high pigmented grapes and blend them in at very low percentages. The clarity issue, they were just filtering the living daylights out of stuff. There was no floaters or no. You would never think to find a Surly bottle. That's not a good thing. But that's again perception and attitudes and how they want to approach it. You'll notice and when you taste afterwards, you notice the bottle labels, and I really found it funny. They build into the label name a year. Doesn't mean the wine came from that year, but that's the label on the bottle, which your mentality, it's a 1982 this. Well, that's the trade name, 1982 this. Doesn't mean it was made in 1982. So that for us, in terms of how we read labels and everything else, it kind of inferred this thing. So, and some of these, I visited some places and they were saying that they had a 1991 Cab Sauv, and I knew from the particular area there was no Cab Sauv to be had. And when you tasted it, it didn't taste like Cab Sauv to me, but it was red wine in a bottle. But it was a low-priced wine, and how they consumed it. After this, I'll give you a little example of kind of how it was proposed to me when I met the mayor of Penglai and the other dignitaries of the area, and I was quite taken aback of how wine was consumed, but that's a whole other story.
What was Peter's view on things?
Capacity was there. The ability to implement was a great question. We looked at it, catch wires, some innovation. A lot of we spent as much time asking why and how and things, And they thought we were going to bring them great revelations on some stuff, and we walked away and said, you know, you already know. You have a good local base knowledge. Now it's a matter of refining what you do. So it was a chance for him to see other things. I had taken him to Western China with me, and this was like a major step up from where we had been previously. So I told him I owed him this trip to see some of the nice ones. But there's good investment. There's some very sharp financial people moving in. Now it's a matter of how it filters through with this separation of how it's produced.
Another question for the online participant. Do they make ice wines? And if they do, in what region?
Do they make ice wines? As far as I could find, I didn't find any area that was making ice wine. In Western China, they were investigating whether they could or could not. I think their bigger challenge where I was in Western China is that their summer temperatures were getting into the 40 Celsius range in the summer, and they were getting minus 30 Celsius in the winter. And all of their vines in that particular area, they buried 100% every winter. So I wasn't sure how they were going to make ice wine by leaving it above ground, getting it to the ice wine level, and then fast enough taking it and taking a frozen vine, bending it, putting it underground, and covering it up with soil. So they hadn't thought too much about that. There was some talk about the cryogenic, but the true ice wine, I haven't talked to anyone that was going down that path. They were looking at buying, and the one there, when I tried to find out more, and I still didn't find out where they said they had sourced ice wine juice from Canada and brought it in to make the ice wine. So that's why they were putting it on the label. Grapes grown in Canada, ice wine. It was a juice, but I still haven't tracked down how it got there because I don't know the legal ramifications of whether it was supposed to be there or not. But that's a whole other world. There's no other questions. We've done not too bad. What we will do is have a tasting at the end. I brought 3 bottles. I'm not saying good, bad, or indifferent about them. You get to have your own observation of them. Take a look at the labels, look at how they're put together. Once we're finished tasting them, I'll explain what the price was for each bottle, and then you can decide whether you would pay that for it or not. Okay? Thank you very much.